Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to walk you all through how to make this 3D anaglyph style image. All you'll need is one image that shows some form of depth. For this example I've actually taken this from Google Images. That will be fine as this is to be used for educational purposes only. Obviously, when you're working on your unit for this project, then please go out and try and create something that has lots of layers of depth. Right, so let's get started. So we're starting with this image. As you can see, it's very different to how we're going to end up. The first thing we need to do is we need to create a group of selections. Now, what I will be selecting is this first area here, our subject, the handrail, and I'll actually be selecting all of the gaps and taking those away from the selection. This is going to take a little bit of time, so I will speed this up so it's done nice and quick. I might slow it down at any areas where they're particularly important, but the main thing to remember is that I'm using the polygonal lasso tool. If you can't see that, then click and hold and make sure that you have this middle one selected. To create my first selection, I'm using this single square. That creates a new selection when you click, so that will, if I create a new selection now, it will override that. If I want to take away from my selection, which I'm going to do in these bits here where you can see the mountains behind, I will actually switch over to this one where you can see that it subtracts. Now if I select within that area, it will actually take that area away, so that will give me the gaps that I will need so that we can create a sense of depth behind the railings. That's why I actually selected this image, because I thought the handrail would be really good for adding that sense of depth to the image. So no more talking from me. I'm going to speed up my selection process because this is going to take a lot of time, and if there's anything I need to talk about, I'll slow it down. So just very quickly, I'm zooming it in to the image where I'm making the selection so I can get really nice and close. I'm doing that by pressing Control or Command plus, and if I wanted to zoom out, then I can press Control or Command minus. To change to the hand tool, I'm actually pressing the space bar, and that allows me to drag the image around without losing my selection. Okay, so here you can see some strands of hair. Now I'm actually going to make my selection include where I can see a little bit of these. It's only going to be rough, but I'm doing this so that these pop out of the frame and really add a sense of realism. Now, because these hairs are so fine, it's going to be difficult to kind of get everything, and if you had hairs in your image, you'd have to make a judgment call on what you want to select. Okay, so now I'm pressing Control minus and I'm going to zoom out so that I can click all the way around back to the beginning. So if I hold down Control, you will see this small circle will appear where the mouse is. That, if I click, will end the selection. So here is my selection so far. Now I'm going to switch over to the minus or subtract from selection, and I'm going to zoom back in. Zoom in nice and close. We're going to start here, and then I am just going to go through the whole image again, subtracting from my selection. So I'll start there and go around the edge. And do the same. So each one of these selections is going to take away from my main selection. And you can be as detailed or as rushed as you want. And obviously this kind of technique is going to depend on what is in your image. So just checking to make sure there weren't any areas of my subject that I hadn't subtracted. So here we're making sure that we're subtracting the foreground element, not that background element here. We don't want to remove that from the selection, we don't want to copy this line, should I say. We want to cut out from the railings because that is our foreground interest. So now I can just double check that my selection's complete, and as you can see, everything I've selected is that walkway, the floor is selected, our subject is selected, and we have some strands of hair selected. So from this selection we now need to create a new layer. So I'm going to hold down Control Shift and press N, and then I've got a new layer, and this is the closest part of our image. This is our foreground, so we'll call it foreground. And now I want to fill this layer with pure white, so I'm going to make sure that my foreground and background are black and white. So if they're not, you can press this icon here where you can see the black and white. Press that will reset it to your default foreground and background. If you want to switch them around, you press the arrows next to them, and then we have white. So now if I go to edit and fill, we can select with the foreground color. There are many different options. If you wanted to select with the background color, pick a specific color, pattern, content aware, history. You've got black, 50% gray, and white. In this instance, our foreground color is set to white anyway, so we'll just fill it white, and we're going to deselect. So to deselect, you can press Command D, or you can go select and then deselect. Okay, so this top layer, this white, is now our foreground. What we have to do now is create a new background, a new layer with a slightly darker shade of grey, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a depth mask. And how we do that is we are going to tell Photoshop how far away certain objects are from the camera by giving it a shade of grey, or a shade from white to black. So our next selection, I'm going to start here. So just give you a very rough example. I might go sort of round some of these clouds to about there. So that would be our next selection. That's really rough, and we're going to do it a little bit better than that, but this would be our next closest element to the camera. And as we go back, so maybe like here, like this area here, would be a slightly darker shade of grey, and then we would do that from here. All of this again would now be darker, and each one of these areas of colour are going to be on a new layer, and we're going to stack them behind our foreground. So that means we can make very, very rough selections, and we can stack them behind. So anything that we have down here would be covered by our foreground. Now you will probably see why I wanted to make sure we took away from the handrail, because it means that we can actually see we can actually see our layers through our foreground layer. Now the furthest away element is obviously going to be our sky, and that will be like here, and that's going to be pure black, and we're going to graduate from black to white at the front. So let's start with the next element furthest up, the next element further away from the camera. So again, I am zooming in by pressing Command or Control A. Obviously we can't see behind the handrail in this image, so I'm just sort of guesstimating the distance. But what this will do in the end effect is this will actually give the clouds a sense of depth by including them in our selection. Now we are going to pick a shade of grey. So what I'm going to do here is just go a little bit darker, maybe there, click OK. So now that we've picked that colour, we're going to create a new layer. So I'm pressing Command Shift N. We're going to call this 1. No, we'll call this light grey. That's what we'll call it. So we've got a new layer now, and we're going to fill this with the grey that we've selected. So we'll go Edit, Fill, Foreground Colour. Now, as you can see, that is over the top of our image, but we can change that by just dragging it behind the foreground, and you'll see the white appears on top. So we're going to select, deselect, and now we are going to find a new area to work on. This layer will be slightly darker than the last. So here, I think we could follow this line here. In fact, what we'll do, we'll make it easy or easier, and we'll go with this one here. Okay, so again, we've made the selection. Now we need to make a new layer. So Command Shift N, we're going to call this I don't know, you can call it anything. I might go darker light grey, because we're going to have probably about a mid grey underneath this. So we're going to drag that underneath the light grey. We're going to pick a darker light grey, click OK, go to Edit, Fill, Foreground Colour, and there you can see it sits behind our other two layers. So now we can deselect, we can go Control D for deselect, and then we can make a new selection. So here I'm going to select these peaks here down to here, and then I'm going to skip across to maybe here and select these clouds. Just very roughly select those, and here come down to here. Okay, again, now we're going to select a slightly darker shade of grey. So that's about a mid grey. We're going to create a new layer. We are going to fill. And then we're going to make sure that's underneath. I'm going to deselect. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing with each individual layer, and I'm just going to speed up that process so I'm not waffling all the way through it. So here I've just made a really rough selection of all of it. I'm going to change my colour to black. I'm going to fill that. No, I'm not. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to call this black, because this is the sky. This is the furthest away that we can get from camera. And then I'm just going to drag that underneath that layer there. Right. So now, because all of these elements are still slightly further away from camera than what they are, for example, if we have a look at the foreground, now obviously this part of our image is actually closer to the camera than our subject is. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the burn tool. If you don't already have it, it's located here. You might have the dodge tool. The burn tool is the hand, so we make sure we have that selected. We've set that opacity to 8. We're going to make sure that we have a foreground layer selected, because if we don't, it won't. If we have the black layer selected, it won't have any effect on our foreground. So select our foreground, and we're going to start painting in probably from about here, because this is slightly further away from the camera. We're going to paint that in. You can see it's gone kind of a grey colour now. Okay, so now I'm going to move in a little bit further, and I'm going to do the same thing again. And the reason why we've got the low opacity is because I don't want our subject to disappear into the background layers, which she is starting to already. So here you can still see it is a little bit darker behind there, but what we're going to do is we're going to darken this part, this top sort of edge away, because if you imagine this being a three-dimensional image, then this part here is going to be closer to the camera, so we're actually going to paint slightly darker over our light grey image, and that will create some separation there. You see that? So we're going to do that, and then we're going to go on to a darker light. We're just going to paint. Doesn't have to be over the top, we just want to darken it slightly from what it starts at, and then we can do that with all the other layers if we need to. Now that we're working on the greys, I think once we get past this grey, what we'll actually need to do is go into the mid-tones, because now we're working on a mid-grey. So now that we've done that, we've dodged and created that sense of depth. What we need to do from this point is take all of those black and grey layers and flatten them. So there's lots of different ways to do this. What I'm going to ask you to do though is select all. So we're going to press Command A, and then we're going to press Command, Shift and C, and that will copy all of those layers. And then when we select our top layer, so that when we paste over the top, it will give us one layer of all those layers merged together, if that makes sense. So we've copied everything and we're just going to paste, and it will be one layer that shows you everything. So it was Command, Shift and C. Now we're going to press Control V. Can you see that new layer here is everything, all of these flattened down into one image and pasted over the top. The next step is to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we're going to set this to 10 if it isn't already. Once you've done that, we can select OK. Now we need to save this as a displacement map Photoshop document. So we're going to go File, Save As. Here I have lots already. I'm just going to put displacement map. Okay, so I've saved that as a Photoshop document. So that has changed the file name. Now I'm going to open up the JPEG again. So there we are. I'm just going to drag that in. Right, so the first thing I want to do to this image is I'm going to actually turn this black and white. So the first thing I'm going to do to this layer is, because I want the final image to be black and white, so I'm going to desaturate this layer. If you want your final output to be in colour, then do not desaturate it. But for this tutorial, I'm going to make it black and white. So what I'm actually going to press is Control, Shift and U, and there you can see that it's completely flattened out the image. So now I'm going to make a copy of that. I'm going to press Command and J to duplicate. So this layer here, I'm going to select the padlock and I'm going to double click, and here I'm going to uncheck the blue and the green channel. I want both of those unchecked. I'm going to select the double click the top, and I'm going to uncheck the red. Okay. Now I'm going to go Filter, Distort and Displace. I'm going to set this to 10, the horizontal scale to 10 and the vertical scale to 0. I'm going to make sure that we've got stretch to fit and wrap around. Then I'm going to click OK. I'm going to select my displacement map, and there it is. So now if you look at the image through your 3D glasses, you should see that all of those individual layers now look like they are separated, and we've created this sense of 3 dimensions.